Hi everyone. So for this week's video, we're gonna do the first part of David Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. So this is another one of those books that we're gonna read all the way through. It's another one of these books that is an epistemological treatise. We have a few of those under our belt at this point in the class. Um, and it's a very, very interesting text. What sort of makes Hume's essay concerning human understanding so unique is that nowadays, I believe more or less the sort of philosophical consensus, for the most part, is that David Hume was the most rigorous empiricist, and that his own works, the Treatise on Human Nature and the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, are the best examples of an early modern empiricist epistemological theory. So, it's really going to be representative of what we think of as sort of embodying most of the second half of our course, which is empiricism. Um, so that's kind of the vibe. And I think that another reason why people often will look forward to Hume, a lot of people experience Hume as sort of like a breath of fresh air, um, because his attitude towards philosophy is very, very different from most of the philosophers that we've engaged with up to this point. It's important to consider that Hume was like a very worldly person. Um, he attempted to write philosophical work very early on in his career. This is the Treatise on Human Nature. But it really got a very cold reception. And so, for a very long time, my understanding is that Hume sort of didn't concern himself with philosophy and instead, like wrote books about history, for example. And this is sort of where more of his academic fame kind of took off, was in his historical works, not so much his philosophical works. And so later in life, he wanted to sort of represent his philosophical views. I think that most people interpret there being some adjustments made, between the two presentations, and then later put out these essays that are something like, an outline of his point of view. If you're interested, the treatise concerning human nature, you do have some sections of it in your textbook. In a previous iteration of this class, I actually did try to teach a little bit of it. But really, what's so good about the inquiry is how self-contained it is. It's really tight, very focused presentation of some very, very interesting ideas. So later on in life, Hume enjoyed, more acclaim, I think, and these works were given more attention as a result. And so I'm really interested to see sort of what y'all think about Hume as sort of being the last empiricist that we're going to be looking at. And it's also important because Hume plays sort of a pivotal role in the history of philosophy because of his relationship to the next philosopher that we're going to be discussing, who is Immanuel Kant. Kant is like really kind of the capstone of this course. Kant was the first person to sort of frame the early modern period as a dispute between the rationalists and the empiricists. I mean, to some extent, you have that in Leibniz's argument with Locke, but I think Kant is sort of responsible for firmly establishing this as sort of the principal trope of understanding the early modern period. And the reason why he's such a good bookend for this class is because he claims that he resolves the dispute. He claims that he synthesizes empiricism and rationalism and gives sort of the best account of both worlds in some way, you know? So he sort of puts an end to this chapter in the history of philosophy by at least proposing that he solves the underlying problem that motivates both approaches. And Kant's relationship with Hume is that he says in a book that we're going to read the entirety of that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And so, in other words, if Kant thinks that he sort of like finds a solution to the problem that centrally motivates all of early modern philosophy, then he understands Hume as posing that problem, posing it but not solving it. Okay, and so a lot of the way that we sort of now as contemporaries understand Hume is sort of through this Kantian lens, that he presents a problem, right? He presents his own kind of solution to the problem, but it's a solution which figures like Kant, or if you're, someone kind of more sympathetic to a figure like Leibniz, that you're going to think is really wanting, right? And so Hume is going to pose a challenge to you as a kind of skeptical philosopher, of someone who tries to undermine all of the claims that you make about the kind of knowledge that you have, the sort of concepts that you think you have a firm grasp on. For Hume, the question is sort of like, well, what is always the source of justification for this kind of concept, right? And that's what makes him a really great skeptical philosopher. I think it would be also worthwhile to note here, just for a moment, for those of you who are interested in non-Western approaches to philosophy, that David Hume's philosophy often closely resembles forms of Buddhism, right? David Hume subscribes to a number of sort of quasi-Buddhist beliefs. For example, David Hume believes that the self is an illusion, which is sort of like a core tenet of Buddhist beliefs. And many of the ways that Hume sort of wants to get philosophy more practically oriented resembles a lot of the sort of practical goals that embody Buddhist approaches to philosophy. And so there's kind of a lot of reasons to be interested in Hume, right? You can be interested in Hume as sort of the greatest representative of empiricism. You can be interested in him because of how he poses this question that Kant claims to solve. And so Kant sort of implicitly sets him up as asking the most important questions in early modern philosophy. You can also approach Hume as a philosopher who, in a Western context, sort of comes about a number of beliefs that emerge in Buddhist philosophy, both especially in its Indian and Japanese variants, right? So Hume has a lot of overlap for a lot of different sort of potential philosophical interests. And I think that beginning to understand that would require us to sort of say a little bit about Hume's approach to philosophy. So Hume drew inspiration from the academic skeptical schools in ancient Greece. So there's been, like, in the discussion forum, I've really loved this, by the way. It's made me very happy. That there's been a very, very fruitful ongoing dialogue sort of about the relationship between early modern philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy, right? And you can see a lot of motifs in ancient Greek philosophy commented upon directly or indirectly by a lot of early modern philosophers. I mean, in what we read only a couple of weeks ago, Leibniz sort of compared himself to Plato, and Aristotle, and Locke to Aristotle, right? And so you kind of have this general, I don't know, in the same way that Plato emphasized sort of our pure ideas and how we could relate to the forms, so too the rationalists want to emphasize the importance of mathematics as a kind of knowledge, right? And how we arrive at universal truths. Whereas Aristotle was always concerned with knowing particulars, right? And sort of building knowledge edifice from your knowledge of a bunch of particulars, right? And in that way, that much more closely resembles the empiricists. You might also recall, just to comment on it briefly, that Descartes in Princess Elizabeth's letters included, I don't know if it was in what you were assigned for this class, but at some point later on at least, I think I mentioned this in the lecture at the very least, then the discussion sort of turned to a discussion of Seneca and sort of Stoic ethics, right? So it's not even just Plato and Aristotle, it's also Hellenistic philosophy that came afterwards, right? And so the academic skeptical tradition, basically, to sort of rehearse what is probably a familiar story for most of you, but just to make sure, around 400-ish BC, Socrates was running around Athens and annoying people, and Plato was his student. Socrates didn't write anything down, right? And generally, sort of the vibe of a lot of Socratic dialogues is that Socrates doesn't really put forward any specific kind of knowledge. He doesn't claim to know anything, but he sort of wants to philosophically investigate other people's beliefs, right? So oftentimes Socrates will have other sort of characters teach him, right? And he finds problems with their account, and it sort of goes like that, right? Okay. Plato was much more concerned with providing substantive answers, right? Of having a doctrine, right? And so a lot of the sort of dialogues, even where Socrates is talking, where he's giving sort of more robust account, we typically think of those as being Platonic dialogues. They're more reflective of Plato's perspective or point of view than Socrates's. And there's plenty of room to debate this sort of characterization, but this is generally, at least one way of interpreting it, right? Okay. And so in that way, you can kind of construct a difference between Socrates and Plato. Socratic dialogues like the Euthyphro or the Meno or, dialogues like that, those are Socratic dialogues because Socrates doesn't really have a doctrine. He's not proposing anything, right? He's trying to test other people's beliefs. And, according to the other evidence that we have, like Aristophanes, for example, other characterizations of Socrates, this is kind of more consistent with what we know of the historical Socrates. Whereas other dialogues, such as The Republic, for example, that's a book where Socrates is putting forward a theory about justice, right? And a theory about the forms. And in that way, he sort of claims to have some substantive kind of knowledge. And so we typically are more likely to attribute those to Plato. Okay, so why am I saying all of this, right? And it doesn't matter if you've not read any of this. The point is this. Plato established an academy, right? But after Plato's death, the academy was sort of taken up by some philosophers whose general belief was that Plato had not really sufficiently followed the kind of ethos of Socrates' philosopher. Plato had kind of fallen into a kind of dogmatism. Whereas the spirit of Socratic philosophy is to ask questions, it's to interrogate established modes of knowledge. Plato is more about propagating his own beliefs, right, or whatever. And so the way that academic skepticism characterizes itself is as sort of continuing the general spirit of Socrates' endeavors, not in the Platonic mode of like giving a theory of forms or something like that, but instead on suspending judgment about the things that we genuinely can't know. Okay. And so in Hume, this reflects a tendency on Hume's part to always ask the question, what is the source of justification for, whatever belief or whatever concept we want to use, like a concept like substance, right? Hume's question is always like, where did you get that concept and what is it useful for explaining? Right? How does it do that? Right? Hume is sort of asking this question: how can this concept do all of the stuff that you want it to do? What is its source of authority or legitimacy? Right? And so, what the academic skeptics thought that you got out of this sort of Socratic spirit is that you were able to know, as Socrates did, that you don't know things, right? That you don't really have an adequate source of justification for these sort of concepts, right? And this can lead you toward sort of like suspending judgment on the things that you don't know, and that's part of living a good life, right? And so similarly, Hume kind of thinks that if you always sort of ask this question of like, what is the source of justification for this kind of claim, then you can make sure that you're not guided by kind of religious dogmatism or superstition, right? You can only be guided by things that you have a firm grasp on, right? And in this way, you're kind of more free than you would be otherwise, right? If you're purely following tradition, then it's hard to think about yourself as free. Okay. And so this is really how Hume is different from a great many of the philosophers that we've discussed up to this point. Because while they were interested in providing, substantive characterizations of like epistemology, like how we get knowledge, right? And sort of charting a path towards like how we can continually gain more and more knowledge or gain more and more clarity about our own knowledge or something like that, right? Hume is instead more concerned with just describing the situation that we're in epistemologically with all of its uncertainty, right? I wrote here, philosophy's central purpose is anthropology, or the science of human nature. This is why Hume, sort of originally called, why Hume's first book is the Treatise on Human Nature, right? And so, from Hume's perspective, philosophy errs primarily when it enters into metaphysical disputes. So, metaphysical disputes are these disputes about which, like, we can't even have any reasonable way to resolve them, right? Hume is trying to get us to ask, what is the source of justification in our metaphysical claims? Like, where does that come from? And ultimately, Hume's empiricist answer is that, well, the only source of justification that you could ever find for a claim like this would be experience. But metaphysical claims, because they're metaphysical, right, they're about the ultimate nature of reality, that is always beyond our experience, right? And so rather than focus on these aspects that by definition we can never experience or never possibly know or never have any possibility for adjudicating, philosophy should be concerned with things that it can adjudicate, that it can decide on, that you can get knowledge about, which is the human perspective, right? And so, if Leibniz, for example, was completely disparaging about anthropology, it's because anthropology could only be like a kind of very limited or relative kind of knowledge with respect to an absolute kind of knowledge that would describe metaphysics, mathematics, and logic, right? By contrast, Hume is going to claim that metaphysics is the least certain of all sort of disciplines, and basically ultimately claims that it amounts to something like a pseudoscience, right? Or, like astrology. Like, it appears like you are saying things that are meaningful, but they're not really meaningful. But okay, so we need to sort of get to the particulars of Hume's analysis when it comes to these metaphysical disputes. So what he's going to do, how he's going to show that philosophy errs when it enters into metaphysical disputes is to give an account of our nature, right? To describe the kind of sources of justification or sources of epistemic authority, right, that we have in us, and kind of show ultimately how far those go. And so we're going to move to this corner right here. So I've written here, species of representation. So the way that Hume's going to proceed is Hume's going to say, kind of similarly to Locke, right? Locke said that all of our knowledge ultimately stemmed from sensation and reflection, right? Hume's version of this, we kind of saw with Berkeley, right? That there's a lot of dispute over how much knowledge exactly do you get from reflection, right? Leibniz had an extremely expansive view of the knowledge that you can get from reflection, that it could far exceed the knowledge that you get from sensation. In fact, it grounded in some ways the knowledge that you have of sensations, right? Locke kind of had a medium amount of knowledge that you could get from reflection, right? You can know that there's a material substance that's the cause of your sensations, but you can't really know much more than that, right? And then Berkeley evacuated reflection entirely of anything that you really get beyond mere sensation, right? In this way, Hume's view really reflects Berkeley's the most, right? Hume thinks that the sort of discussion about reflection, it really encourages you to have a very expansive view of like what sort of authority that reflection really gives you, right? And so rather than talk about reflection, Hume is going to talk more about thoughts, right? And he's going to talk about them as being species of representation, so kinds of representations that you can have. And basically, Hume's account is this: you can have two kinds. You can have a sensation. These are clear and distinct. They're of particular things, right? So in this case, you can see that this is my phone, right? It's clear in the sense of like I can kind of focus in on different details, right? Like I can try to attend to its color. I can try to attend to, how certain parts fit together, right? And the more closely I pay attention to it, the more things that I'll see, right? So that's the sense of its clarity and its distinctness, right? Is that I have the capacity to turn my attention to various levels, scales of detail, and so on, right? And it always concerns a particular thing. And the image that it has is vivid, right? We often are prone to thinking about sensations as being primarily visible, right? But you can also think about like a burn, right? Like a pain, right? A pain is an example of a sensation for Descartes that is very, very clear, but it's not distinct, right? It's just like, ow, right? And that ow is very clear in terms of what it means, but it's not very distinct, right? You don't necessarily have pains that are very localized, right? You might not know what's going on or know why it hurts or anything like that, right? But on Hume's account, sensations are sort of the height of distinct and clarity that you have, and they're always of particular things. Thoughts occur primarily in memory, right? And basically, Hume's account of this species of representation is that it's a reproduction of a sensation, right? So, in addition to having my phone in my hand and actually looking at it, right, I can take a moment, I can remember, right? And ultimately, what Hume is trying to do is Hume is trying to say that, hey, what Locke talked about as being reflection, what Berkeley also talked about as being reflection, is merely memory, right? And so if you clarify that this sort of species of representation is really only reproduction, right, then you're really making clear that all of our thoughts depend on sensation, right? I only have the capacity for reproducing something if, I originally had it, right? That's the idea behind Hume's philosophy of thoughts. And so thoughts are obscure, right? So like whenever I try to remember my phone, maybe I don't remember the shade exactly correctly. Maybe I have not really captured like the fingerprints or whatever that I'm sure litter all the front of my phone. Um, I'm sure that like my mental image of the little apple on the back doesn't exactly like look like what the Apple one looks like, right? And because it's not in front of me, because I can't, attend to it more, right? Like I don't have a source for this, right? If I try to hone in on the details more. And this is the obscurity of thoughts by comparison with sensations, right? They're a mere reproduction of the sensation, and so you can only sort of reproduce what you originally have taken in some way, right? And our thoughts sort of proceed further than sensations in some sense, and that's through this last thing that I've written here, which is abstraction and generalization, right? So, like, I can see a bunch of orange things or a bunch of red books or something like that, and then I can abstract from the particulars of, like, oh, this one was written by Locke and this one was written by Kant, and only attend to the fact that they are red, right? And then I come across a concept, namely red, right? And that forms sort of a thought. And it's obscure in the sense that I'm extracting from the details of particulars to be able to think about a wide array of cases, right? But Hume, like Berkeley, wants to insist that the validity of your thoughts only extends as far as it being a generalization, right? So it's not like by seeing a bunch of red books that you like see into the form of red or something like that, right? It's instead that you form a more or less adequate concept according to the sample group of experiences that you have. That's sort of the idea. And so Hume's an empiricist for basically insisting that thoughts are kind of parasitic on sensations, that thoughts are reproductions of sensations. And so the legitimacy of our thoughts can't extend beyond the things that we can sense. And so you can kind of get Hume's skepticism surrounding, our ability to engage in metaphysical inquiry, right? Because if our thoughts only extend as far as our sensations, then just like Berkeley said, we don't have any sensations of a material substance, right? We don't have any sensation of any of this metaphysical crap, right? So it doesn't, our thoughts don't really correspond to anything. They're not gripping on anything, right? One way that one philosopher characterizes this is that it's frictionless spinning in the void, right? Which sort of carries, I think, the sort of image about how, like, it has a sort of slipperiness, right? It doesn't have any contact with anything. You don't have any way to verify it or ensure that it's correct or anything like that, right? It doesn't have any grip on reality. It doesn't have any experience that you could have that could affirm or deny it. And it doesn't make a difference, right? Which is sort of this ethos that Hume has about philosophy, which is that by focusing too much on these thoughts, you kind of are forgetting about the fact that they no longer refer to anything, right? They don't have any grip on your world as you actually live it. Okay. So, we want to talk more about what we meant by abstraction and generalization. We want to think about the order. Oh, I'm realizing that the ring light is particularly intense at this point. You want to think about the orders of your sensations, right? And the orders that Hume claims that they come in are 1, resemblance, 2, contiguity, and 3, cause and effect. Now, what does this mean? So when Hume says that certain sensations resemble one another, what he means is that you can abstract from some quality that they have, that you can abstract from all qualities but one that an object has, and say that they resemble one another in virtue of both having the same quality, right? So what I was mentioning earlier about books, right? I have a lot of read books. I can then attend to their color specifically, right? Direct my attention specifically to that, form a concept of the color red, and now I have a rule for sort of organizing my experience, right? I can organize my experience by trying to think, oh, what's all the red or what's all the pink stuff I have, right? And then, I sort of like think about all the stuff I have and I can order it by this means, right? So a lot of the ways that we think about our experience is we order it, right? We order it by various qualities, right? We think about food, well, we group yummy food together, and we group disgusting food together, right? They resemble one another in virtue of having certain quality, right? Whether you would want to call that a primary or secondary quality, right? They have the quality of yumminess, and that's how we order a lot of this stuff, right? You don't just go to any random food place, right? You think about food places in terms of how good they are. Okay, so that's one way sensations can be related. Another way that sensations can be related is that they are contiguous with one another, right? They're just close together. And Hume's example of this is 2 apartments, right, in an apartment building. They don't need to be the same color. They don't need to be the same shape. They don't need to resemble one another in any qualitative respect, right? What matters is that they are contiguous. They're next to each other, right? And so what contiguity shows is that there's a way that our sensations are related to one another, not in virtue of the properties that they have, but in virtue of being ordered by time and space, right? Things are next to each other, moments appear side by side with one another, even if they don't have any qualitative resemblance. Okay, and the last one is cause and effect, right? And Hume says that this is sort of the lion's share of the important ways that we think that things are related, right? Because the fact that things are contiguous, the fact that they're next to one another, right, that is an arbitrary property. It can be more or less, right? It's kind of subjective in that way, right? You're not going to discover objective laws just by seeing things being merely contiguous with one another, right? And then similarly, resemblance is ultimately kind of like a subjective characterization of your experience, right? You think these things are like one another, right? And so you order them that way. Whereas in cause and effect, you're not merely saying like, I think about them this way, but you're saying that they objectively are this way, right? That smoke is the effect of fire, says that every time there is fire in the right conditions, then there will be smoke, right? And so these don't form necessary relationships between the sensations, but cause and effect does. Cause and effect always says that the cause will temporally precede the effect, and the effect will necessarily follow from the cause, right? And so these sort of have more of a subjective ordering. This is an objective ordering of our experience. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about for this video is we're going to introduce the idea of Hume's fork. And what Hume's fork refers to is, you're supposed to imagine that you hit a fork in the road, right? You have one or two options, right? But neither option ultimately appears to be appealing. Excuse me. And so, yeah, neither option's good, right? What are you gonna do? And Hume's way of phrasing this question is quid juris, right? I don't know if he actually uses this Latinized terminology. Actually, this is how Kant characterizes this question. It's quid juris, which is, what is the right? What is the law, right? Jurisprudence, right, is about the law. So what is the law? What is the source of justification of causal judgments, right? So if cause and effect is an objective ordering of the world, we're not, we're making a necessary judgment, right? What is the source of that justification? What lets us say that every time there is smoke, there will be fire, right? Before we discuss Hume's answer, we're going to discuss the problem in more depth, right? Okay. So Hume says the fork is this. You have to choose between relations of ideas or matters of fact. And these correspond to the two species of representation that you talked about previously. Relations of ideas correspond to thoughts, whereas matters of fact correspond to sensations, right? And here's what Hume has to say. Relations of ideas are how our concepts relate to one another. So, for example, you can know that a bachelor is an unmarried man. And in fact, you can know that 100% of the time. You can know that with no empirical evidence. You can know that with no experimentation, right? You can know that simply in virtue of knowing the definition of what a bachelor is, right? This is the claim that a lot of these early moderns make, and this is their favorite example, so I want to keep their example, right? And the reason why you don't need any empirical inquiry into that question is because that's just what it means to be a bachelor. It just equals being an unmarried man, right? In the same way that like 2 plus 2 simply equals 4, right? And so this basically, relations of ideas are not about how or whether our ideas track onto the world. It's about how our ideas relate to each other, right? unmarried man is identical to bachelor, right? Because those definitions are interchangeable. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Those quantities are interchangeable, right? Um, and so one way of characterizing this language that is kind of more Kantian language, but if you've run into this in other classes, they might have used it, is that relations of ideas are analytic judgment, right? The concept bachelor contains being a man, right? It's like one of the necessary components of that definition, right? Um, and so this kind of knowledge doesn't expand our knowledge, right? We're not learning things about the world, we're learning things about how we use certain concepts, right? And this is Hume's account of mathematical knowledge too, that mathematical knowledge is about how our concepts of quantity relate to each other, right? And so it does not expand our knowledge. And as a result, it's inappropriate for causal judgments. Why? Well, because causal judgments are objective, right? They're not just about how our subjective orderings of our experience. It's not just that I merely experience smoke after fire, right? It's that I genuinely believe that the smoke is caused by the fire, right? And so the objective pretension of causal judgments grates against it being a mere relation of ideas, right? Okay. Hume also has other arguments like, you can sort of engage in a conceptual analysis of the concept of smoke or concept of fire all you want. You won't just by definitions come to smoke, right? You won't come to know about the world purely through looking about how you use concepts, right? Okay. And now you can talk about matters of fact. And matters of fact are genuinely synthetic. They expand our knowledge, right? Whenever I sort of like take in some matter of fact, like whenever I see the room, for example, right, I connect it with my previous experiences of the room, right? I'm accumulating these experiences over time. I'm synthesizing them together, right? And I'm getting a more and more adequate conception of the world. So you might be thinking, well, the way that we learn about causal stuff is we have experiments, right? Like you can try in a bunch of contexts to start fires and see if every time they cause smoke, right? But rather than the matter of fact justifying the causal principle, you're assuming the causal principle in your interpretation of matters of fact, right? Because to conduct an experiment, you're already assuming that there are legitimate causal judgments that you can make about the world, right? In some ways, matters of fact are the source of all of our knowledge, all of our objective knowledge at least, about the world, right? But all of it assumes the causal principle as merely given, right? Rather than justifying it, right? You can think about it this way. How can you prove that the future will resemble the past, right? And one temptation is to say, well, in the past, the future has always resembled the past, right? But far from answering the question, right, you merely repeated it. Okay, and so what is sort of the Socratic uptake or the skeptical uptake of Hume's answer is that Hume says that causal judgments are, their source is actually not in relations of ideas and not in matters of fact, but actually in our habits, right? We experience a constant conjunction of smoke and fire, right? And then out of habit, we say, oh yeah, the world's like that. right? But we never like have any insight into the nature of the world, right? We never directly experience the causal force, right? They're merely constantly conjoined together. They're contiguous with one another, right? And then over time, I sort of shift into an objective description, right? Rather than saying every time I experience fire, I experience smoke, I say fire causes smoke, right? But Hume's skepticism is to say that we're not justified. We don't actually turn to either of the sources of justification, not relations of ideas, because it doesn't really fit causal judgments, right? And not matters of fact, because this is merely circular, right? It assumes the legitimacy of causal judgments, right? And so Hume is saying that it's merely a habit we have, right? It doesn't come from knowledge at all. It's actually something that we carry in common with animals, right? Animals assume that the future will resemble the past. Do they do that because they have some kind of super special, secret, esoteric knowledge? No, they do it because that's how organisms survive. What, right? So rather than I don't know, firmly establishing our causal judgments in a foundation that's completely irreversible or something like that, right? That's like kind of the ethos of the Cartesian philosopher or the rationalist. Hume just sort of says, oh, well, you know, I guess if you look at it philosophically, there is no justification for our causal judgments. Meh. Okay. Well, we probably shouldn't have been so concerned with finding that anyway. Right? Hume sort of has this view where it's like, you know, you arrive at that view, right? You don't have any justification for causal judgments, and it's all rooted in habit. But, you know, the sort of rationalist picture is that then you'd worry and fret over, like, whether the sun is going to rise tomorrow or something like that, right? And Hume says, even if you don't have knowledge, right? You don't know why the sun is going to rise tomorrow. You know that it is. And that's good enough for your life. And that's good enough for our finite perspective as human beings. And that's what we got to live with. And so whenever we take our sort of philosophy hat off and we're not expecting ultimate metaphysical knowledge or something like that, then we can sit satisfied with where we're at. Which is that our causal judgments are results of constant conjunction, we're never fully justified in them, but that we rely on them all the time. So we're going to keep using them and not really worry ourselves with this sort of arcane philosophical inquiry. You know, he kind of, I think, has described in various books sort of this image of him like you just sort of leave your philosophy worries behind and go to the bar. Right? And I think that that's very appealing for people because, you know, a lot of the times that is what happens. It's not that you know, you finally resolved all your worries and, you know, you figured out the grand philosophical system or whatever, and like now all of, you know, your actions are totally reasonable and all that kind of stuff. It's more just like you become more or less perturbed by a philosophical problem, and sometimes you arrive at a skeptical conclusion, and sometimes it isn't everything that you hoped for, but it's where you're at. And that's Hume's attitude about his response to the problem of causality. That he bites the bullet. He says all of our causal judgments are not really objectively justified. Physics doesn't peep into the ultimate nature of reality. We just get more and more better approximations of what we can possibly get from a human perspective. And that's it. And insofar as we want anything beyond that, then you know, we're bound to be disappointed and suffer as a result. Okay, that's Hume. Went a little bit longer than I was hoping, but I hope that you found it engaging. And we'll talk more about Hume's inquiry next week.